as we go through life, all of us eventually will come to a point of experiencing grief. But as followers of Christ, how do we process through that grief, and what do we do about it? Let's take a look at that.
You are watching the Beyond Sunday podcast.
All right, Zach. So today we're going to talk about processing grief. For us here as a church family, this is something near and dear to us. It's something that we've either are actively going through, or for some folks maybe have recently been processing through. So I think it's important to think about the fact that as we look at grief, I think some people think that maybe we're beyond and above grief as followers of Christ, that, these kinds of things don't stick to us, don't impact us.
Yeah.
But they do. We shouldn't just move past them as if we're somehow above and beyond all this. But how do we do that well?
Yeah. So I think for starters, it's fair to say that I think grief comes on many different levels.
Okay.
And grief can feel, maybe for lack of a better term, scalable. Like there are small measures of grief that we may experience that almost feel tolerable. And then there are monumental levels of grief that we experience, maybe with significant loss or something like that. The phrase, "you're giving me grief," that type of a thing.
Yeah.
So in very minor ways, that is a real thing. I was preparing for this conversation, and there was a C.S. Lewis quote that I thought was really interesting. He said, "Grief turns out to be not a state, but a process."
Okay. Yeah, I
and
get that.
I was thinking about your awful smoky tea, how it gives me grief, and
that's different.
And the process would be you hurrying up and finishing it so that we don't have to smell it anymore.
I don't think you get the grief we're talking about. All right, Charlie Brown, we're not talking about the exclamation of frustration.
Yeah, but in all seriousness, I think that grief certainly gets touchy, and I think it is common for a lot of people to feel like as Christ followers we're not allowed to, or we're maybe beyond it in some way, but then it gets difficult because you experience things, and then that conflicts with the reality that maybe you don't feel like you're allowed to feel these things.
Okay.
So if I don't feel like I can experience grief, but I am, or I'm feeling a lot of things, and I maybe don't know it's grief.
Right.
I think there are some consistent stages in the whole grief spectrum.
Okay.
That as I was kind of doing some study and look on this, the first one, which I thought was interesting, is just the shock stage.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, there's an immediate shock.
This.
Yeah. And also fair to say, I don't think there's a right or wrong speed that we walk through all of it. The reality is we all will experience grief.
Right. Yeah, it
is.
If you live long enough, you certainly will.
Right, is part of what we'll experience.
Right.
And so this immediate that you feel is a sense of shock in some sorts. Mm-hmm. It's a total shock to your system. And then for some, you may go through a second stage of anger.
I get that, yeah.
Frustration, anger.
Yeah, I can't believe this happened into this did, and I'm upset that it did happen.
And it kind of feels like the whole thing is waves. And then another stage hit depression.
Okay.
You may reach a point of depression. And then the fourth stage was bargaining. And almost for Christ followers, maybe even we bargain with God.
Right. I think that's fair.
In order to prevent pain in the future. Lord, don't ever let me feel this again.
Okay.
Or something like that. Yeah. And then acceptance. And that's when we begin to move on.
Okay.
And as I was thinking about that, moving on is not the loss of pain. It doesn't go away necessarily, but we're processing in a healthy enough state that we begin pressing forward.
Right.
It maybe doesn't make the pain less real.
Mm-hmm.
However, we're in a way that we can begin navigating through it
Right.
after we've worked through those stages.
Right. Yeah.
And so it was interesting as I just kind of did some preparation, because there's a lot of things that I know I've experienced in my life, and I would have not associated it with grief. And then now, as we walk through a season as a church where we're walking through grief, it's almost given me some realistic understanding of past things that I've experienced.
Okay, yeah.
That were also grief that I didn't allow to identify as.
Really? Okay.
Which is interesting.
That is.
To me.
There's, one of the podcasts I know that we've listened to, Patrick Lencioni's At the Table. There was an episode they did where they were talking about change. And as they were talking about change, they said one of the things as you change, you have to really process loss. And I think loss and grief have a very close relationship together. Usually you feel and experience grief with the condition of loss. So, we probably, when we hear the word grief, usually think of a loss of a loved one of some kind. But I think there are all kinds of stages or scales, sizes, experiences of grief. So, as you move from, a job to another job, there's a loss of some of those relationships, a loss of some of that rhythm and environment. Even if it's not a good job, something you felt like you really fit in or anything else, there's still a loss. You may be really excited about the next thing, but there is a loss. And so, grief, I think, can be experienced in any type of loss that we have. Or, in your case, you guys are about to be parents and things. So there's going to be a loss. While there's a massive gain, you got a little girl coming and you're super excited about that.
Yep.
There is kind of the loss of some of the freedom
of what we've known as reality.
Right. Yeah. It's like, wow, we used to be able to do this. Well, we can't do that anymore. And there's some loss that you experience. And so therefore, if there's loss, then the feeling that kind of correlates to that is a grief of some kind, I think.
I haven't got there yet, but thanks for bringing that up. I'm just kidding.
Sorry.
And I don't know how much we want to share, at least, but I know common to us, we're walking through a season of grief where we lost a really, really close friend.
Yeah.
And beyond friend, pastor, mentor, leader, in so many different arenas in life. And I remember spending time with a close friend of some of our church team, and processing through and talking about how to understand grieving, and almost feeling like I don't know if I'm allowed to yet.
Okay.
Because as we walked through a season, we didn't know what the outcome may be.
Right. Before we hit actual grief, we're in a waiting first.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And one of the things that this gentleman shared with me was that we should always feel safe, and it is healthy to begin grieving whatever stage we are currently in. We don't have to grieve for tomorrow, but there are things that we experience that we have to process through. And so at that time, what I began grieving and processing was the loss of the time that I had been used to spending with my boss, my leader. Yeah. So I had, weekly meetings one-on-one where we had FaceTime, we had relationship time together. And he was in the hospital, still fighting, still with us.
Right.
But I had still lost that time.
Right.
And so he had encouraged me and helped kind of walk me through, begin grieving that loss that I'd experienced. And I think that's where it starts to feel scalable for me.
Okay, gotcha.
Because there's many, many, many stages that we go through of just processing along the way. And I think as we learn how to walk through them piece by piece, it makes it more manageable when it gets heavy.
Okay. I think, as we've processed this as a church family, and we've experienced so many things, because some of us began grieving, like you were just saying, a process of grieving earlier. Some began grieving at the moment of loss. So with these various things and various personalities, that one of the things we realized early on is don't let the way someone else grieves or anything else define how you have to do it. There's no one way. There may be a typical, like you were talking
about to say that,
a typical rhythm that we see or stages that we most often see, but don't expect or don't let other people put an expectation on you that you should grieve in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And we've experienced that. People will come up to you and go, wow, you must be feeling like this right now. You go, well, actually, I don't feel like that right now because I'm at a different stage. Maybe it's ahead or behind or whatever. Mm-hmm. Maybe I linger in one section, one kind of stage of grief more than you do, and then I muscle through another one quicker. There's all kinds of different ways that it can look. And when we're in the anger stage, as an example, some people might get really busy. They might work really hard, and so there's this anger that begins to form, and it turns into excess energy, and they start cleaning and do spring cleaning through their whole house. Or someone else may lash out and get angry, or I'm going on a long road run, and I'm just going to burn all this energy out. As long as it's not destructive or unhealthy or hurtful, then there's a lot of different ways it can come out of us, and that's okay. Yep. So we need to make sure that we don't try and conform to the fact that someone else grieves in this way. I must look like that and feel how you feel, because that's insincere, and we're all wired a little differently.
Yep. And I remember you sharing that with us, and I appreciated that. It was a good perspective because, even as I looked through these kind of generic but general consistent processes of grieving, I never found myself in the anger state.
Gotcha, yeah.
That's not how I'm wired. However, I lived in the shock state for a while.
Okay, gotcha.
And so as you had said that, it was such a great reminder, and the same is true if you're watching this episode. We know that we will experience grief, and so as you begin processing it, know that you've been wired to process and grieve a certain way. And discovering that, one, we have to be healthy about it. Mm-hmm. And so, like you said, we can't be destructive.
Right. Not even self-destructive.
Yeah, and it's not an opportunity as Christ followers, at least, if you're a Christ follower, it's not a free pass to engage in sin. It's not any of those things. It is healthy processing. And for some of us, we may need to yell at something.
Sure.
That's not necessarily sinful. It can't be destructive, but we have feelings, we have experiences, we have emotions that have to get processed. And so I remember you saying, I have a heavy bag in my basement. Norm has something he can go punch if he needs to, and it not be a human.
Or a wall, or anything that's destructive.
Or anything that's destructive.
Constructive.
Right.
And one of the things that's interesting about wiring, we might assume that, because in my case, I do have kind of those more aggressive styles, the sports I engage in are more aggressive sports, things like that you would assume, okay, so as you move through some stages, boy, you probably felt that anger one really well. Nope, skipped right past that one too. Mm-hmm. I didn't have that one. Mm-hmm. If it was like a very small blip. I was living in kind of, for me, much more tender, softer spaces than that. So yeah, even if you assume, well, I'm probably like this, because there was actually a point, no kidding, that I felt like, man, I should be mad about this. I need to go downstairs, put the gloves on, hit the bag for a while, because I'm just going to need to just, And I actively thought about it, never felt the need to.
But don't you think there's a reality that, based on the nature of whatever it is you're grieving, is going to radically shift how you need to process it?
I totally agree with that.
Even though we are wired uniquely, I don't think that you would say that maybe naturally you're going to lean more towards an aggressive side of processing.
Yeah, probably so.
That doesn't mean that everything you process has to be aggressive.
Right.
Given the relationship that we had with this person, there was a closeness and a health in the relationship where sadness, yes. Shock, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bargaining, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't get to the anger.
Right. No,
I didn't
agree.
have any of that wrapped up in any of my emotions because that didn't live in the relationship. And so each situation that we have to learn how to grieve, it's
Right.
going to feel different because of
Right.
that.
Yeah, and I think it's the nature of the loss and how the loss occurs, and so as we're talking about the fact that your grief shouldn't look like somebody else's, don't assume that your grief will even look at all like the last time you grieved.
Yeah,
You
maybe
know,
not.
Yes, because of the circumstances. While this may be my wiring and things like that, that this is probably, if you were gonna put some lunch money down on this, that which way I'm gonna go on this, you go, well, it's probably like this. But don't force yourself into, well, I do this, then this, then this. Or even, if you're well-educated and you know the various stages of grief and go, oh, I am now going to experience this. We have to be sincere and experience what we actually are experiencing, what's stirring in our heart and our feelings. And, one of the things that I was thinking about is that, as followers of Christ, we mourn. And so there's nothing in Scripture that exempts us, because we talk about joyfulness, and joyfulness is a real deal as followers of Christ, but mourning doesn't cancel joy. Mourning doesn't make joy hollow or fraudulent. Like, apparently you don't really have the joy of the Lord because you seem super sad right now. Hey, you're grieving the loss of something. Thought you guys had joy. We actually see more examples in Scripture. While, yes, there is joy that we're to hold on to, there are real teachings and real moments, even directly from Jesus, where we're talking about what do we do with trouble. We even get told by the Apostle Paul, if I'm remembering right, he says, mourn with those who mourn. So talking to the church family, he's saying, mourning's a real deal. And as a matter of fact, he didn't say, by the way, rebuke them. He didn't say cheer them up. He didn't say, tell them, hey, get up, let's wash the face, let's get going. He said, you sit down and you mourn with those folks. You be with them. He didn't say bring joyfulness in the middle of their mourning. There's, in that section, he's talking about this very balanced attitude. People who are celebrating and praising, celebrate with them. Even though if you're going, I didn't get the best end of the deal. No, you celebrate with them because I'm for you. Stuff we've talked about before.
Yep.
In that for you, in that one another kind of attitude, in joy, I'm for you. And when you mourn, I mourn with you. I don't try and, hey, let's get you out of it kind of stuff. It's, no, I want to be with you.
And that's a good word. I think there's a moment where it can be more dangerous, and most of the time more dangerous than helpful, to process through caring for somebody, thinking, let's get them out of this.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You kind of mentioned that, and I think there's again, that goes back to the conversation about allowing people to grieve in the ways that they need to. Right. And so we're all going to go through processes as Christians, as Christ followers. I had thought about, and I was latched onto this word refuge.
Okay.
That we see throughout Scripture, but especially in the Psalms. Yeah. And I was thinking about this word refuge, and as we process and press into grief as Christians, we have a place we can run to. And so I would also say we don't process by ourselves. That's what our relationship with Jesus allows us to have. And so I had looked at Psalm 9:9. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. So we see a place that we get to run to, and we also see the reality that we're going to need to know how to run there. We will be oppressed. We will have times of trouble. We're going to experience all of that. And so
all the way through.
Anyway, that I was latched onto that word.
I love that word picture, because you're right. It is in Psalms again and again, and David uses it a lot. And if you read the entire Psalm where something like that appears, usually there's a lot of grief mixed in the midst of that. Oh yeah, my enemies are against me. I'm pressed on all sides. I feel broken down and hollowed out. But yet, here's my refuge. And the thing is with the refuge, I always kind of think of this idea of like a lighthouse or a tower or something like that that's made of stone. It's going to stand the weather, the test of time, but you run into it to seek that shelter in the midst of the storm.
Yep.
And just because you're there doesn't mean the storm stopped outside.
Right.
The storm could still rage out there, but you have a place, or in our case, a person that you go to that says, in this space, there's peace, there's rest, there's an answer.
Yep.
And together we're going to wait out the storm. We're going to hang out through the storm, and eventually the storm will pass. But just because we go to it doesn't mean the storm's done the moment we get there.
Yep. Yeah. It is and I like the word you use, it is our rest.
Uh-huh.
And it's the peace in the middle of a storm. You're right. It doesn't get rid of the storm. It's our rescue in the midst of it.
Right.
And we find rest. Again, as Christ followers, we find rest in Jesus, in the person of Jesus, in his presence. And so I had thought about Romans 8:26.
Okay.
At times when we don't also know how to engage, we don't know what to say, we don't have anything specific to say, we don't need to experience God's rest.
Right.
And so we need to learn how to find rest in Jesus. But Romans 8:26 says, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness.
Right.
So we see this role, for we do not know what to pray as we ought to, but the Spirit himself intercedes with us with groaning too deep for words.
Right.
And so I love the promise as believers that we don't have to know what to say when we're with the Lord. Rest in the Lord doesn't come if we say the right things. It is there and available for us when we show up.
Right. And I love the fact that, again, going back to the Psalms, we see that that God is near to the brokenhearted. That the truth is that he's always close at hand. And, I think it could be easy to say this, so somebody could write this off and go, yeah, but it's the truth. The truth is always in fashion, whether, it's something you want to hear or not. The truth is always still the truth. And the truth is that God is near to the brokenhearted. And the truth is he is always there to be our refuge. He is always there to provide us with his rest. There are things that we may want and wish for, in that bargaining and negotiating part of grief. God may tell us no, which, we've had to walk through in a season that the Lord said, I heard what you wanted, but that's not the answer I want to give. I think we'll talk about that more in an upcoming episode. But the thing is, there are some things, and you and I have talked about this, that you can always approach and always ask him for. There are things that, are solid ground, always fair to ask for, because he goes, no, I've promised this to you. And, I've promised that I would give you rest, that, and it may not be these externals that you're thinking about, but in my presence, you're going to have that rest. And so as we go through grief, one of the biggest things that we can have, whether it's in the middle of anger or in despair, any of those stages, we're always going to need some kind of rest for our soul, because it's going to be overwhelmed at different times, and we're going to need to draw close to him.
Yep. I agree. It's a hard conversation, and it certainly changes when you begin walking through it, but it's something that we all experience. And so as Christ followers, we have hope to find rest in Jesus, and he will help us process our grief, but know that it's okay, and it goes in stages. If you have any questions, let's please keep the conversation going. Join us in the chat, and we'll keep talking through this. But for today, that's what we know.
This has been another episode of the Beyond Sunday podcast. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe.